In this video, I'll show you 3 different ways of managing state inside of your Cloudflare Workers application. I'm Kristian Freeman. I'm a developer advocate over at the Cloudflare team, and if you saw my previous video on this channel, which we called Workers 101, you learned all sorts of things about deploying your applications to Cloudflare. So we created an account, we created our first Workers application, and we even looked at some cool things like Hano, which is a web framework that is supported by Cloudflare Workers, as well as building with AI. So there were a lot of interesting things that we did in the first video, but one thing you may notice is, okay, this is cool, all of these applications work or these ideas work, but as soon as I refresh the page or as soon as my application gets restarted or like an hour later I come back to it, everything is gone. And that's because we don't have state in our applications. So normally you would reach for, say, a database or some sort of key value store, and what do you know, it turns out that we have both of those inside of Cloudflare Workers, Cloudflare D1, which is our database, and Cloudflare Workers KV, which is our key value store. And so you can use both of those. I'll show you how in this video. And you can also integrate with external databases and services. So we'll be looking at how to integrate with Prisma in this video as well. So there's all sorts of ways to add state and add data to your application. And in this video, Workers 201, I'm going to show you everything you need in order to get started. So make sure to check out the links in the description, all of the source code for the different projects in this video, as well as links to all the things you need to check out in order to wrap your head around Cloudflare Workers. And of course, if you haven't watched the Workers 101 video, which is about an hour long, we posted back in March, I really recommend that you check that out first. Still be me, so if you really want to hear me talk for another hour, you can go check out that video. And that's all the prerequisites you need in order to get up and running. So let's jump into it. So for this first example, we're going to be taking a look at how to deploy an application that uses an API. So we'll be looking at an external API and how to integrate it inside of this application, as well as persisting it inside of Workers KV, which is a very basic but powerful key value store inside of Workers. So to begin, let's create a new application. I'll just say npm create Cloudflare, and I'm going to give it a name. I'll say API and KV example. We'll use a hello world script, which is the most basic one here, and we'll say yes to TypeScript. So if you don't understand what's going on here, again, definitely recommend checking out the Workers 101 video where we cover this tool and the Wrangler command line interface that we'll be using later in this example. So yes, I'll deploy this application. It's going to log me in real quick, and it's going to go ahead and deploy it. And let's see where it ends up. API and KV example.signalnerve.workers.dev. You can see it just says hello world. So pretty basic so far. Now let's take a look at the code and see what is actually inside. So API and KV example, actually, let's go inside that directory and say source worker.ts. So there's a lot of code here. Again, we kind of looked at this in the Workers 101 video. And so in this case, let's just kind of clean it up for now. And you can see it just returns a new response, hello world. So the first thing we're going to do is install a new package here. So I'm going to say npm install Hano. Hano is the web framework that we covered in the previous video, Workers 101, and it's sort of a web framework for building applications quickly with Cloudflare Workers. And we'll be using it in all of our examples, just it makes the code a little cleaner. So let's open up source worker TS. I'm going to import the Hano package, or I guess class, from the Hano package here. And then I'm going to replace this code with 2 lines. So first, app.get. I'm going to pass in this first argument here, which is the path, just the root path here, and then C, which is a context for this request. And I'll just say c.text hello world, and that will just return hello world back as the response to this slash request. And then the second thing I'll do is export default app, which just returns the Hano application as the interface to this worker. So that'll mean that Hano will sort of respond to all the requests and do all the stuff that needs to be done there. Okay, so how do we do something more interesting? This is basically the hello world stuff that we wrote in the previous video. Let's actually kind of make it interesting in some way. So let's imagine, for instance, a endpoint that, given any username, will go and look up all the information on GitHub for that corresponding user. So to do this, we need to make an external request to some other service, right? Some other API endpoint. And then we need to sort of parse that information here inside of the worker and return it back as the response for the request. So the first thing we'll do is I'm going to update this endpoint and give it a parameter here of :username. That means that if I make a, say, GET request to /Kristian Freeman, this will be my username. So it'll be, username Kristian Freeman. Now, how do we actually use that inside of the callback function here? Well, I'll turn this into a multi-line, and I'll say username equals c.rec, which is our request, .param. And this is a function that takes in a key here, which is just username. So we're going to get this username from the request, and we're going to save it to this variable username. Now, the next thing we want to do is actually make a request to the API for GitHub, which is what we're going to use here. So built into all workers applications is the fetch library. If you haven't used fetch before, it's great. You probably use Axios or something like that. Now, you can use Axios inside of workers, but fetch is more than enough for our purposes. It has async await support. It has, you can do abort controllers and stuff like that. It's all the advanced functionality you'd want. It's really come a long way, which is great. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say fetch https api.github.com/users/ and then it's going to be the username here. And in this case, well, this is actually a parameter, so let's change this into a template string by just replacing these with backticks. And then instead of just getting the user information, maybe let's get a list of repos. It'll be probably more information than just my normal API endpoint, because I have a lot of repos on GitHub. So we're going to make a fetch request. And then if you, again, aren't familiar with the fetch API, basically our first argument here is the URL. And then the second is options. This can include things like the method, headers, and anything else that you might want to pass in. I think the abort controller is another one. I can't think of all the parameters, but there's a lot of stuff you can pass in here. In this case, the method is just going to be a GET request, which is the default, so we won't pass that. But we will need to pass a header here, which is the user agent. And so I'm going to say, looks like my Vim got messed up here, but that's okay. User agent is set to, and I'll just say CF worker Kristian. I don't know, something. You need to have some sort of user agent here to identify what's actually making a request. Let's just say CF worker for now. And so that will be our headers that we're passing in, and that's all that we need to do to make the request. Now, this is an asynchronous function, meaning that we need to wait for this to come back so that we can operate on the data. So you can use .then, and you can sort of do like a chain of promise handling there. But what I prefer to do here is actually turn this into an async function and say await fetch, which will return a response back as the result of this promise. So we're basically saying, go make this request to the GitHub API, and then once it completes, capture the thing that comes back. This is going to be of type response, which is going to be in this variable resp. So that's how that will look. Now, the next thing we want to do is actually get the JSON that comes back from that. So we can say data equals await resp.json, and this is another function that is a promise, but once it returns, it will be an object here of all of the repo data. And then the last thing we can do is actually return this back to the user. So let's say return c.json, and then just pass in the data parameter here as the single argument there. So I'll save that. And now let's actually run a deploy real quick. And you can see it's not going to take too long. Oh, I have a glitch in my code. And that's because I didn't actually set up a Hano application. That's hilarious. So let's do that real quick. Const app new Hano. And then this is going to take in some types here, just bindings, and then call this function here. So this bindings is going to be the list of bindings for our application. In Workers 101, which is going to be linked in the description again if you haven't seen it, we looked at how to add AI bindings to our application. And in the same way, we want to set up bindings here, which we'll be filling in just a little bit. And basically all I have to do here is just change this to type bindings, and then I'm going to make it just an empty object for now. We'll come back and add things later, I promise. So now let's save it and try deploying it again, and we should see it works this time. API and KV example, there we go. And so now if we open this up, I'm going to just copy the URL. And then back here, I'm just going to say, well, I already have it here in the address bar, but I'm going to give it a username. So I'll say /Kristian Freeman, which is my GitHub username. And you can see all of this data comes back here. Let me kind of shrink it a little bit. So there's a lot of information here. This is all of my public repositories on GitHub. So this is all well and good, but now one thing you may notice is that each time I refresh, it takes a little bit of time here, and it's also making another request to GitHub. So this leads us to the next sort of data primitive that we can add into our application, which is workers KV. So workers KV is our key value store. And what that means is that for any key inside of your KV namespace, which is just where all your keys are stored, you can have a corresponding value. So for instance, it could be some data from an API endpoint. It could be some caching information. It could be like a score of a team that you're sort of tracking in real time. And the reason you would use KV is two things. First, it's very straightforward. It's just key and value. It's really easy to put information in. But the second is that it excels particularly at reads. So if you have something that is read a lot, say for instance a cached value where writes are really expensive or getting data is really expensive. In this example, we'll be looking at a GitHub API, which is pretty fast, right? Like the GitHub API is very performant, but it may not be something that you want to get every single time a request comes in. So if I'm hitting this endpoint 60 times, every hour, I might want to just cache that inside of KV and then be able to read it really quickly and write more infrequently. And that's where the magic of KV really comes into effect. It also has a ton of really useful stuff like expiring keys. So maybe I want to put some information in there and have it automatically sort of go away in an hour or expire. That's really useful as well. And it has built-in JSON parsing and stuff like that. So if you're storing complex data like JSON, I'll show you in this example how you can sort of automatically parse it and make sure you're always working with the right types of data. So that's hopefully a good overview as a sort of developer perspective of why I found KV useful, and let's jump into it. Now, how do we actually get started with workers KV inside of this application? So in order to do that, we're going to say npx wrangler at latest KV namespace. So that's going to be the subcommand for managing KV namespaces. Well, let's take a look here real quick and see what are all the things we can do. We can create one, we can list them, or we can delete. So you can get a kind of helpful guide here. In this case, we're going to obviously create one. So let's say KV namespace create, and then I'm going to give it a name. In this case, I'll just call it cache. So I'm going to give it a name, it's going to create it, and then down here at the bottom, you can see it says add the following to your configuration, your KV namespaces array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up wrangler.toml, and you can see there's actually an example here already. I'm going to uncomment this, and then I'm actually just going to reformat this instead of, I'm a programmer, I'm lazy, I want to copy and paste as much as possible. All I did here was just change the sort of object format into this layout, binding equals, new line ID equals. And so that's how that will work. So what this will do is it will make a binding inside of my workers application called cache, all uppercase. And this is going to be the interface to my KV namespace. And so what I can do here is open my worker.ts backup, and I'm going to add my first binding here. It's going to be called cache, all uppercase. And it's going to be an instance of KV namespace, which comes from the workers types. I use Vim here, but if you have VS Code, you'll get sort of type suggestions and stuff like that. In case that is something that you want, you can definitely go check that out. And so with that set up, now I have the ability to access the workers KV namespace directly inside of my application. And so in order to do that, what I can do is I can say c.env.cache, which is going to be the sort of API to my KV namespace, and I can do two different things here. So first, I can get something. So what do I pass in here? Well, it can be a key of any kind, so something like any key, and what I get back is a promise that returns the response from KV. So this could be a string, it could be a number, it could be an image. You can put all sorts of things in KV. It's literally just a key value store where the value can be basically whatever you want given a file size limit. And so what I might do here is say, okay, well, what do I want to get here? Let me come up here and say const cached response awaits c.m.cache.get. My key here, let's put username. What this does is it says, okay, if there is something in the cache that matches username, go and look for that first. And then what I can do is say if cache response, then return c.json cached response. And so what this will do is if there is something stored in our key value store, I can just return that directly from KV, which is kind of deployed at all of our different points of presence, just like your Cloudflare worker is. So it's super, super low latency, and just return that directly back to you without too much trouble, which is great. Now, if that isn't found, then we know we need to go make a request. So we make this request, we get this data back, and now right here, let's say, okay, before you return this back to the client, let's also put it inside of workers KV so that we can use it in the future. And to do that, I'll just say await c.env.cache.put. Instead of get, we're going to say put, and then the key here, which is username. And then the second thing here is the value. So right now we know we want to put this JSON data in. This is an instance of a JavaScript object. And so in order to put this as a value inside of our KV cache, I'm just going to stringify it into a JSON style string, or I guess you could say a string that is JSON. Okay, you probably know what I mean if you've worked with JSON. Now it turns out that when we do this, what we get back on the other end here is that string, right? So we can't just sort of directly interact with it. We know that it is some JSON string that has to be parsed. And so what I could do here is I could say JSON parse cached response, or I can use a shorthand here, which is really useful. And in fact, I think a tip that maybe not a lot of people know about, which is in this get call here, I can pass a second argument, which sort of indicates to the namespace what it is retrieving out of the store. And so if I say JSON here, this will actually automatically parse the JSON as it comes out of the KV namespace. And so I'll get that cached response here. I can return that back. Or if there is no cached data, go and make a request to GitHub and say, okay, this data here, this is again parsing the JSON, and then it's going to cache it inside of workers KV and then return it as data, JSON data to the client. So let's go ahead and save all of that and run npm run deploy again. And you can see this time it has access to the following bindings, this KV namespace. And so now I'm setting up bindings alongside my application. And again, API and KV example. So same thing as before. But what we can do is we can refresh. We can see, let's see, did I catch it in time? Okay, it doesn't say how long it took. Yeah, I didn't capture it in time. It was about a second or so, something like that. But if we refresh it again, we should see it's significantly faster. Let's see, timing here. So it took about 52 milliseconds to respond. I know that text is probably really small. I'll make it a little bit bigger. 54 milliseconds to respond. And what we can also do here is come back into our command line and say npx wrangler kv key get Kristian Freeman, and then I'm going to give it the binding here, which is cache. We'll see if that works. I might have other KV namespaces. Nope, that one works. So you can see this is actually getting the data. Let me pipe it into JQ here so you can see a little bit better. You can see it's taken that data and persisted it inside of KV. So that's how you get data inside of a worker's application using Fetch. It's a very, very easy to use API. Definitely learn it if you don't know it already. And then also a little bit more interesting, how do you persist that inside of workers KV, which is our very basic but powerful key value store that allows you to put all sorts of data inside of it. That is sort of the basic data handling inside of a Cloudflare workers application. Now, this example for this project can be found on GitHub, github.com/Kristian Freeman, API and KV example. You can take this, you can modify it however you want. It's, again, pretty straightforward. API retrieval and caching, but along the way shows you how to use KV, and you can hopefully see why it is such a great value add to pretty much any worker's project. Cloudflare D1 is our SQL database. It's a serverless SQL database, which is something that usually doesn't go super well together, but in this case, it's a great way to build structured data-based applications. So SQL is, of course, the structured query language, and so when you're using D1, you have the ability to create everything in SQL that you know and love. So tables, columns, you can do relationships, indexes, all of the stuff that really makes working with SQL great for complex structured data. And so with D1, you also have the CLI that you can use to create migrations. You can roll back and forth in your database between different versions of your data. You can back it up. There's all sorts of things you can do directly from the command line. And you have a built-in SDK as well, so you can issue SQL commands directly inside of a worker's application and get that data back. And then at the end of the video, we'll also look at some interesting wrappers around D1, including Prisma. So you can do things like, for instance, say, Prisma.people.find where city equals Austin, Texas. And what it will do is translate that JavaScript sort of SDK interface, which is pretty straightforward. There's no weird SQL stuff you have to learn. Well, it'll go and convert that all into SQL for you and execute it against your D1 database. So D1 was just recently released out of beta. It's awesome integration and addition to the Cloudflare Workers ecosystem. Let's jump into it and take a look at how to create and query our first D1 database. Now, how do we actually get started building with D1? Well, it's going to take us a couple things we have to sort of figure out ahead of time, and then we'll jump right into it. Let's start by creating a new project. So npm create Cloudflare at latest. And in this case, I'm going to give it another example name here. I'll say maybe D1 movie example. That's kind of a hint of what we'll be building. And in this case, I'm going to say hello world worker. One thing I just noticed, actually, I wrote npm create Cloudflare at latest here as sort of, that's like a default. I do at latest a lot on these packages. And this is actually a different list of applications or starters than what I showed in my KV example. I promise I didn't do some magic cutting. That was only a couple minutes ago. I just passed the at latest flag here. And in this case, the hello world worker will still be the right thing. You can see that the sort of list of applications there is different. I don't want you to think there's some like editing magic going on. Regardless of whether you do npm create Cloudflare or Cloudflare at latest, the hello world worker is what I've been using here the whole time. So you shouldn't see anything super different, though if there is, I'll call it out as we kind of walk through it. So again, just making a TypeScript application, doing all of this sort of deployment stuff, installing dependencies and things like that. I'll say yes for Git version control and yes for deployment. And again, here we have this hello world, just like our previous example. So I've just CD'd into the directory, and now if we open it up again, you can see it's just another example here. In this case, actually looks like the hello world here is a little shortened from the one I showed previously, which is totally fine. Again, we're going to do all of the same sort of stuff to set up the application, so the content of this doesn't matter too much to us. So let me close out of Vim. Again, npm install Hano. We're going to use Hano again for this. And then if I open this back up, I'm going to say import Hano from Hano. I'm going to set up a new app this time. Should be Hano. Let's set up some bindings again. They'll just be empty for now. And then here I'll say bindings, set to bindings, exactly the same as what we did before. So don't worry, there's nothing new here. This is sort of the basic set up the application, set up types, etc. Okay, so what we're going to do here in this application is we're going to, it's slightly more advanced than the previous one, but hopefully still really interesting and easy to pick up, is that we're going to use a D1 database to both persist and retrieve information that is structured in a way that, people like me who like structured data really makes me happy, makes me like I enjoy working with queryable, anytime you're building an application of sufficient complexity, something that is queryable and consistent, and that is SQL. The name of the game is like consistency and sort of like things are the way they are, which I love. So KV, you can kind of imagine, well, you can put anything and everything in there. Certainly has its place, right? There's certain applications and there's certain sort of workloads that make sense for KV. Well, there's also workloads that just, I want SQL at the end of the day. And so D1 provides that, which is great. So we set up our application. Let's create a D1 database. Now, here's your pop quiz. Do you know how to create a D1 database? Can you guess just based on the stuff that we've done up until now, whether that's in this video or in the Workers 101 video? Well, if you guessed saying NPX Wrangler at latest, D1, right? The D1 database create, you were correct. So we have this D1 sub command, we have this database, I don't know, is that a sub command, something like that. Now if we run it here, we can see what are all these commands. Well, there's D1 list, info, insights, create, etc., etc. There is all sorts of things here, and in this case, you know what, I was actually wrong. It's D1 create, it's not database, but unknown argument database. That got lost on the scroll back. So I failed my own pop quiz, which is great. Nice job to me, but that's okay. NPX Wrangler at latest, D1 create, and then a database name. In this case, let's just call this movie example. I'm going to give it a name here, and it's going to go and create that, and you can see it created your new D1 database. Just like with our KV namespaces, there's all this output here that I want to put into my Wrangler TOML. So let's go ahead and copy that and then paste it here at the very beginning of my D1 databases. So database name will be movie example. Database ID is a UUID of my database, but the part that we care about is DB, which is the binding, which says available in your worker on env.db. So let's open the worker back up here and set that up. So I'll say DB is going to be a D1 database, and then that will allow me to access it here inside of the bindings. Now, before we can do anything with this D1 database and start building the application, we need to take a sec to model our data. So this isn't KV. You can't just drop whatever into the KV namespace. It's a SQL database, so you need to create a table, you need to define the columns and say how everything works. So to do that, what I'm going to do is create my first D1 migration. You can see up here, there's this Wrangler D1 migrations command. Let's actually take a look at that. I'll say Wrangler latest D1 migrations. So this subcommand says, well, we can create a migration, we can apply a migration, or we can list them. So let's create our first one, npx Wrangler latest D1 migrations create, and then give it a name here for my database, which is movie example, and then a second one here, which is a message or sort of description of what the migration is. And in this one, I'll just call this create tables, let's say. It says no migrations folder found. It's going to try and make one by default. That's fine. I'll say yes. And now you can see I have my first migration here, which is create tables.sql. So let's go ahead and open that up, and this is where we can write our first migration. So let's model our data real quick. In this example, what we're going to do is basically just have a list of movies that I like or you like or whatever. I'll give you a list of movies just for fun at the end. And what we need to do here is create the table that movie data is stored in. So we know that it probably is it's going to be a table. It's going to be called either movie or movies. We know that it's going to have a couple things. It's going to have the title, it's going to have a release date, right? That's like when the movie came out. And then finally, it will have a rating, and that'll be like 1 to 5. So title, release date, and rating. And because this is a SQL database, we'll add one more thing here, which is an ID. And this will, in this case, just be a auto-incrementing primary key, 1, 2, 3, 4. It'll be an integer. So pretty basic stuff. ID, title, release date, and rating. And so now let's actually make the SQL commands to do this. So first I'm going to say drop table if exists, movies, which is the name of the table. I'm going to create the table movies. And I'm actually going to make these both, yes, that is proper SQL formatting. So I'm going to give it a list of columns here that I want to create. The first of which is ID, which is an integer, and it is our primary key. And also it's going to auto increment. So again, it'll be an integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It'll auto increment based on the number of movies. Next is title, which is going to just be text and also cannot be null. So we have to give it a title of some kind. Release date, which is also going to be text, and I'll just say not null. You might want to make that a date or something in your sort of more robust applications, but in this case, it'll be fine. And then rating, which is also going to be an integer, and it's going to be not null as well. And so that is our migration for creating the movies table inside of our database. Now, how do we actually run this? We'll say npx wrangler at latest D1 migrations apply to movie example. And what it's going to do is give me this nice little interface to apply a migration. And I'll say yes, just apply this 001 create table. It looks like I did something wrong here. I'm pretty sure I know exactly what it is, which is I think I forgot a semicolon there. Did I miss any commas? It doesn't look like it. Let's try it again. Yep, that was the problem. So classic SQL stuff. Make sure to use a formatter or something so you don't run into that like me. But that's okay. So we have executed it on our local database. You can see it actually gives me a path here. Let's go ahead and see what's in there. Wrangler state v3 D1. Looks like we have this D1 database object. Well, what's inside of that? Look at that. It is a actual SQLite database, which is really cool. So when you're working locally, you get to just work inside of a SQLite database. But when you're ready to deploy it to your remote database, you can add this remote flag to the command. So you can say apply movie example -- remote, and that will run the migration against your production database. So that's super handy. Next, let's actually make a sort of set of example data for this application. So I'll say npx wrangler latest D1 migrations create. Now the order here was, I think, movie example, which is the database name, and then the migration name, which will just say test movies or something like that. It's not a great name, but that's okay. Let's open that migration up. You can see it's 0002, so it's the second migration after our first one, which inserted the table. Now this one is just going to be a collection of insert calls, so I went ahead and spared you the sort of manual typing of this. I just added 5 movies here, which are like IMDb best of movies. You've probably seen most, if not all of them. And what I did here is I actually went and inserted my own rating as well. And it's actually out of 10. So I'll say Shawshank 6, God, you know, whatever. These are a list of movies. I've just given it these ratings. Don't take these as like my actual ratings. They're just random numbers. So don't get mad at me about movies in the comments. So let's go ahead and save this file. And then I'm going to come back here and run this migrations function again. And this time it's going to show me a new migration, test movies. I'll go ahead and apply that one as well. So now I have my movies table and I have a list of movies inserted as sort of test data. Now let's actually look at how to use the D1 database in our code. So we'll open this back up. You remember we set up this Hano application, and maybe what I want to do here is set up 3 different endpoints. So first is going to be just a list of all of my movies. So get/movies, this will just return all movies. I'll make another one here called get/favorites, and maybe this returns my 3 favorite movies. And how do we figure that out? What is my favorite movie? Well, you can say this is 3 favorite movies sorted by rating. So whatever I've rated the highest, just give me the 3 highest rated movies and return them there. And by the way, these are both going to be as JSON, right? So return JSON data. This is like an API or something like that. In the previous example, we used GitHub's API. Now we're going to use our own API and power it using the D1 database that we've set up, which is awesome. Now the third endpoint here will be a put statement. So put/movies/ID with this parameter here, which represents obviously our movie ID. And this will allow us to re-rate a movie. So I can give it, for instance, ID 1 and say, you know what, this movie was actually an 8 out of 10. And I can send the relevant data there to update it. So now let's go and implement all of these. So let's start with get/movies. It's probably the most basic, and it'll give you a good look at how to use the D1 database database inside of your functions. So first I'm going to say app.get, and I'm going to say /movies here, which is the path that requests will come in and I'll respond to here in this function. I'll just give it an async callback function and grab that C context variable. And so first what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that D1 request. So there's a ton of D1 documentation. I'll put a link to that in the description. But the basics here you need to know is that you have this c.env.db for database, which is our interface, just like with KV, to our D1 database. And what I'm going to do here is prepare a new SQL statement. So this is going to be a string that is the literal SQL statement that I'm going to get ready to execute. In this case, I'll just say select star from movies. And so this is going to be the SQL query that runs when I'm ready to execute this. Well, how do I actually execute it? I'll just say .all, which just returns all of the results from this query. So this is my namespace here. I say first prepare this query and then call it and get all of the rows that come back. This will come back as, say, a response or something like that. And inside of that, we'll have resp.results, which is going to be our movies. So I can just say const movies equals resp.results. And now I can operate sort of on that list of movies. And in this case, I'll just say return c.json with movies. So let's go ahead and test this. I'm going to make a new tmux sort of window screen manager here, and in one, let's say npm run dev. In one window, I'll just run Wrangler dev, and you can see localhost 62363. Actually just opened it. Oops. Let me copy that URL. And then in another window here, I'm just going to curl this /movies, and let's pipe that into JQ. And here is my list of movies. You can see 12 Angry Men, Godfather Part 2. So it's returned this from the D1 database as JSON. And if I take out the JQ here, you can see the sort of full JSON blob here. So get /movies 200 OK, and that is using our local database, right? I'll show you later how to deploy it. You can see the sort of production workflow. It's very, very similar, but that is retrieving data from our D1 database. Now let's go and add one more endpoint here, which is /favorites, one more get endpoint, I should say. And it's so similar that I'm actually going to copy paste it. I'm going to say /favorites. And then what I'm going to do is actually tweak this query slightly. So instead of saying select star from movies, and then I'm going to say order by rating, so sort them by rating in descending order, so the highest rated first, and then the lowest rated down at the bottom, and then limit by 3. So return my 3 favorite movies, sorted by rating, and then just like the other one, I'll return it as JSON here. So let me close this, and I'm going to say curl favorites, and you can see that the list is slightly smaller here, and if I pipe it into JQ, I can see, okay, my top movies are Godfather, Godfather Part 2, and 12 Angry Men, and they are sorted by rating, so 10, 9, and then 8. So that is a slightly more advanced query to your D1 database. Now, how do I actually update data? Querying is one thing. Everyone's probably written some basic SQL statements once or twice, and if you haven't, you just did, you kind of get the gist now. How do we actually update data? That's our next sort of use case here. So if I come down and look at this, put movies /ID. So to implement that, I'll say app.put /movies/ID. That is our parameter there. And then it's going to be an async function with this C context once more. Let me make a little extra space here so I can center this on the screen. It's a little bit more legible. So what we're going to do here is a couple things. First, we're going to get our username parameter, which is just coming out of the URL /movies/ID. And then the second thing is I'm going to get some JSON data that is being put up with the request, specifically the rating value. So I'm going to do two things here. First, I'm going to get the JSON body from this request. So I'll say const body equals c.request.json because this is JSON information that is being sent up along with the request. And then once I have that, I can make my D1 request. Now, this is going to be done pretty similarly to how we did it up here. Await, this database binding, and then we call .prepare with the SQL statement, and then ultimately we execute it. Now, updating our D1 database is not that different. We're going to say await c.env.db, and then I'm going to make a new line here where I'm going to say prepare, and this is going to be where I pass in my SQL query here, and I'll say update movies and set rating to $1. I'll show you what that means here in a second, where ID equals $2 returning star. And so what this does is it says, first find this rating that we're going to pass in and set it to this value. And it's going to be which movie? Well, it's the one where the ID is equal to this value. So that's my prepare statement. And then on my second line here, I'm going to call bind. Bind basically is where we populate these sort of templates inside of this SQL string with the real values. And so this first one here is going to be my rating. So I'm going to say body.rating. And then the second one is going to be the ID, which is going to be c.request.param with a key of ID here. So it's going to say update movies, set rating to, for instance, 10, where ID equals 1, returning the star parameter here, which means just return the entire row back once you've updated it. And then finally, to actually execute this, I'm just going to call .run and call that function. This is a promise, so let's capture this back as our response from the database. Now, in this case, what I could do is look inside of the response. I could grab the movie, et cetera, et cetera. You may want to do that, but in my case, I just care about whether it succeeded or not. And so what I'll do is say const OK equals response.success. And then I'll just return that down here as c.json. So it'll be a key of OK, and it'll either be true or false based on whether this was a success or not. And so in order for this to sort of work, make sure everything is the way we want it to be, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to say curl x put, and I'm going to do a put request here to /movies, and then I'm going to pass in this -d here with some JSON where rating is set to, let's say 10. And we'll close that. So that's a sort of JSON piece of data there. And we actually need to give an ID here as well, right? So /movies/ let's do 5 for 12 Angry Men here. And I'm going to change it from a rating of 8 to a rating of 10. You can see it says OK, true here. And then if we come back and look at our favorites list again, you can actually see that 12 Angry Men has shifted in the list. So it's now a 10 out of 10. It's the highest rating. Now, the last thing we need to do is deploy this application. So I can say npm run deploy, and that will deploy my application along with this D1 database binding that is set up. But if I come here and I go to /movies, I'm going to get an internal server error. What's the deal? Why is my application crashing? Well, it's because we haven't run our migrations yet in production or remotely with our remote database. I'll say npx wrangler latest D1 migrations apply to the name here, which is movie example, and then the flag -- remote. And you can see it's going to load that up. It's going to apply 2 migrations, right? This is our remote database, so we haven't run any migrations yet. Both those migrations we ran were on our local database. And so if I say yes, it will run those migrations. You can see it ran the first one, and then it ran the second one. And now if I refresh here, I'll get my movie list back. So make sure to run your migrations in production or remotely using the -- remote flag, or things won't work. Just like the KV example, you can find this D1 movie example on GitHub. You can take it, run with it, build whatever you want with it. I think you'll find it super interesting. And this is a great solution if you are wanting to build things using structured data and stuff like that. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to show you one more, but I'm going to show you kind of through the GitHub repository because it would take us a long time to build this, and I want to keep this video at under an hour. That is the Cloudflare D1 Prisma Hano X Starter. That's a very long name. If you aren't familiar with Prisma, it is basically a wrapper around databases. It's probably not the technical description, but my sort of practical, I'm a developer and I just want to build cool stuff explanation is you define your data models using the Prisma syntax, and then Prisma generates all the database migrations that you need. It defines an SDK with the ability for typed definitions of your models and allows you to query it all using a very consistent standard sort of formatting. For me, then I don't know how many people in the video will understand what I mean by this. It's like Ruby on Rails for JavaScript, which I love personally. That may mean something to you, it may not. So if you come over to the starter kit that I've set up on GitHub, basically what it does is it combines a bunch of different tools, and you can see I kind of laid them out here. So one is Hano X. You may recall we've been using Hano up until this point in this application. Hano X is a sort of additive thing on the Hano framework that allows you to do the backend API endpoints that we've been doing up until this point alongside front-end UIs. So you can actually just drop React code directly inside of Hano, and it will render it and do all the stuff that you need it to do, which is awesome. Cloudflare D1, of course, is our SQL database, which we have covered at this point in great detail. And then finally, Prisma is a ORM wrapper around D1, allowing data models and querying using a straightforward syntax. So I can do here is set up these endpoints. For instance, this is a person create endpoint, so I can validate the form data that's coming in, and then I can call it, so c.getPrisma.person.create. So I have this thing where I say I have this person model set up, and I can call create, delete, find one, find many, and all of that is supported inside of the Prisma API. What does this actually look like? Well, let's go and take a look at some of the code here. I have some routes set up here, and in this case, I just have to-dos. So let's actually go in this index and take a look. And what I've done here is I've set up this create route and said const to do equals c.getPrisma.todo find many. And so what this does is it will look through my D1 database, which I'll show you here in a second, and get a list of all the to-dos and allow them to be rendered inside of a user interface like the c.render. And then I have this additional endpoint here, to-dos/toggle. So let's go and take a look at that. I'll say to-dos ID, a toggle. This is all file name based routing, kind of like what Next has. So Hano X has support for this as well. And then what I can do is find things like, find this ID parameter, and then find the matching to do. So prisma.todo.findUnique, where ID is set to ID. This will translate automatically into SQL and execute it against our D1 database, which is super, super useful. And then later on, I can say to-do.update. So to-do.update where ID, and then set the data there to whatever. So completed is going to be, I'm just going to toggle completed here. So data is just this completed. And then once I redirect back to that root path, I'll get the updated D1 database information. Now, where this really becomes powerful is if we open up the Prisma directory here. This is my Prisma schema. And specifically, we'll focus on this model here that I've set up. So this is a model to do, which has an ID integer and has all of these sort of parameters here. Well, this is an ID. It has a default, which is auto increment, has a description, which is a string, has a completed Boolean, has created at datetime. So this is all the code that I need to set this up. And then what I can do is I can run, let me scroll down here. I can run this awesome Prisma command, which is migrate from empty and then take my schema data model and output it as SQL. And this is the really awesome part about Prisma that I'm really excited about, is that I've created this migration. Remember, we did that in the last example. We created this migration using migrations create, and then I can use Prisma CLI to basically say, turn my schema into a SQL migration. And so what will be created here is this migration. This is an example migration. You'll have to create your own, obviously, but you can see it creates this automatic SQL statement that translates all of the stuff in our Prisma model to SQL, which is excellent. We can then run that migration just like we did in the previous example and sort of keep our Prisma model and our D1 migrations in sync. So I'm really excited about this right now. Like I said, it takes a little bit too much time, I think, to walk through right in the sort of end of this video. But if you are interested, definitely let me know in the comments. I'd love to do a full video on this. I think it's really interesting. But this is one more example where you can sort of look at using tools like Prisma. We also have an integration with another framework called Drizzly, which shows sort of how you can integrate this more sort of fully featured out data models with your D1 database. Thanks so much for watching the video. I hope you found it really useful and interesting. It's really fun to build stuff with state in Workers applications. It really makes everything feel real, right? It's a cool, real application and stuff persists and it's an interesting application. I hope you had fun and you want to go build something with this. Please let me know in the comments if you built anything cool or you're working on any cool projects. If you have any questions, of course, you can find a link to my Twitter on the description of the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much and have a good rest of your day.